So I was going to introduce you to my book, which is called The FinTech Revolution. It's a Springer book. And the book is available, of course, to all the BU participants in terms of the BU library code. It's a free copy because that's the reason I publish on Springer, because they distribute it to almost 10,000 university libraries across the world. And I've also given you the QR code of the Springer volume. So I am actually not going to focus on all the chapters of the book. Susan decided that I should focus more on the data science, which is the geospatial sciences and satellite science, and constrain myself to showing you use cases, business use cases, financial use cases, and talk about it in greater depth. And I am not going to talk about AI, although it's a very exciting topic. So my book includes interviews by 10 leading experts, some of them in the world of business and some of them, of course, from BU. You probably all recognize a few of the professors, Kevin Gallagher, who is the GDP program director, center director. Then we have Peter Fox Penner, who is left, but he's still connected to BU in multiple ways. So all of these experts provided a lot of insights, especially the business use case studies. We in the field of science and academics don't really get a lot of ways to transform the science into useful data products that the business community, banks, and the financial institutions need. And so that's the reason I'd interviewed all these people. And my co-author, Josh Pitts, who's probably joining us from Austin, is a software engineer. And he sort of did a lot of the tech build-up for many of these use case applications. The other person I forgot to mention is Madison. You probably met her in the last IMAP lunch. And she was phenomenal in talking about the legal aspects of what's happening in these climate regulations and policies. I would also like to highlight a couple of other people as I go along, and I'll come back to them as I speak. Um, Moving forward. So the way that I organized the agenda is I wanted to basically connect planetary boundaries, which are a very important topic. And these planetary boundaries, which have supposedly gone lots of improvements from 2009 to 2023, is given by the Stockholm Institute of Resilience. You may ask, why is this important? This actually gives us a conceptual foundation of understanding the planet and its 9 thresholds, which if we cross, we are going to have lots of problems, and that becomes very relevant to finance. So that's the reason I want to touch briefly on planetary boundaries. Then I want to connect geospatial technologies, talking about GIS, especially to my class, because they just started learning and it's been less than a month. So I want to show some examples so they are sort of, know what I'm talking about and how I'm relating it to the talk today. The next part is the geospatial finance itself, talking about the finance and the use cases from the point of view of an asset. And I'll define what an asset is, and a country or a municipality or a town, and probably even the entire globe. Then I want to look at regulations, and I don't know if I have time to go through all the regulations. It sort of makes you want to cry because much of the regulations in the United States has disappeared at this point, climate regulations. So I will be talking about Europe and some of the other countries if you're interested in terms of regulations. And the last part is the fintech solutions, which are available for banks and other venture capitalists and so on to invest. And I'll talk about a few of those case studies. So the first sort of thing is you can see the planetary boundaries. There are 9 boundaries, and we've crossed 6 of the 9 boundaries according to a 2023 paper. There are only 3 boundaries left, one of which is ocean acidification, and some of you who work with oceans know that this ain't true. The oceans are also in big trouble, and my graduate student Meera is sitting here. She knows what I'm talking about because we are working right now in Belize looking at oceans. And what are these planetary boundaries? They sort of tell you something about society, how can we live, you know, not just for this generation, for the next couple of generations, how can we live keeping in mind the earth's stability and resilience? And what happens if these boundaries are crossed? So all of these have implications for both public health as well as the economics. And the reason I'm drawing your attention, and I have three auditors right in front, the reason I'm drawing your attention to this is traditional finance has never considered sustainability and all the ramifications of climate change, health consequences, biodiversity losses, and so on. If you include all that, it definitely adds to trillions of dollars, and the richer countries have to pay to the poorer nations, which hold much of the wealth of the tropical forest. So I will not spend a lot of time talking about this. You can probably read it in the book. It's in chapter 3. So I'm skipping over it and moving on. So the next slide kind of shows you why is these planetary boundaries so unique and why did we sort of bring it in here? This is where you sort of, for the first time, see the coupling of the human and the natural systems. When you sort of account for the feedbacks that nature is providing you and humans are imposing anthropogenic activities on nature, it leads to all kinds of direct, indirect, and all kinds of impacts, some of which cannot be measured. So if you go about accounting for the services that nature provides, we don't even know how to account for it. Bahar, who's an expert on ecosystem valuation, is here, and she would tell you, we talk about $1 million view, but we don't say what the cost of a tree and so on. Right now, there's a lot of accounting for carbon at this point. And so we want to see how we would account for coral reefs, mangroves, and so on using this accounting scheme. And at the bottom, I've shown you the general schema that's proposed by the United Nations that you should keep in mind. Are we improving women's health? Are we improving water? Or are we sort of improving life on land? Are we increasing biodiversity? All of those things are very important from the UN point of view. The UN, the World Bank, and several, including the Central Bank of Europe, consider the UN SDGs, these goals, before they dole out the money. So it's very important to do the accounting, sort of answering one of them, not all of them. You cannot answer all of them at the same time. You would say, I'm focusing on women, and then you would just do that. Or I'm focusing on children, and you would have to show all the metrics and data for the UN SDG. So accounting becomes very, very important in terms of where we are. So I now want to go to geospatial data and technologies, and I am going to sort of say a few things. And you perhaps know most of this. There are satellites, of course. These days, we talk about drones, and we also talk about IoT array of sensors that you can put on the ocean in order to measure data. All of this is also aided, of course, by the satellites. NASA has satellites, so does Europe, so does China, so does most countries in the world now want to plan to have satellites. There is also a satellite race going on, led by, people like Elon Musk and his cohort of friends. They are interested in private satellites and satellites that sort of cover certain things. And now it becomes important. Why do we need private satellites? Because the satellites that NASA and Europe has a more coarser spatial resolution, which is 1 kilometer or more. Or you can get to Landsat and Sentinel, which is 10 to 30 meters. But if you want sub-meter resolution, you have to pay a lot of money and get into a private satellite or fly a drone. So this is quite possible because if you want to look at an asset like a mine in the middle of, DRC, Congo, you would have to fly a drone or a very special satellite to get all the information because you want to capture everything by way of the biodiversity loss, the forest loss, and so on and so forth. So I will talk a bit about that as we sort of proceed on. So I wanted to say that satellites will monitor deforestation. You can sort of do all kinds of things in sustainable finance. And we're going to be looking at a lot of these use case studies. And I also wanted to distinguish three different types of scales. The asset scale, which is very useful for tracking corporate greenhouse gas emission, which is the GHG and I'm sorry I didn't spell out. But you can sort of think about why is this important? An asset is like a factory, or it is a building that's located in an urban area, or it could be a farm which is producing a lot of methane gas because it has cattle ranching. I would need to just, in terms of GIS, I would need to track the boundaries of this asset in order to attribute a certain amount of emissions that are coming out of this particular plot of land. So that's the reason I emphasize asset level. And asset level is something that banks like to use. So I've used the terminology here. The other one, of course, we are familiar with, which is municipalities or towns, like the city of Boston has a climate plan. California, the whole state has a climate plan. And of course, in Europe, every municipality has to have a climate plan because they have to account for it as part of their CSRD or SFDR. So the last one is I want to introduce is a national sort of scale where we want to talk about carbon trading, biodiversity, topics like that. And all of this is now aided by blockchain. I don't think I'll have time to go into blockchain, but I'm happy to answer questions because that's the way to do it in terms of accounting because it makes it more transparent and we can talk about it. So if you look at the asset level, I sort of programmed it such that it shows this. All of these are my assets at various locations of the US. You can see that every asset has a code attached to it, which is the North American Industrial Code. So if it's a steel manufacturer versus a refining factory versus a Starbucks, it's going to have different emissions. And all of these are calculated by industry standards, and you have a mean for it. The mean emission, 1 ton of product produces so much emission, is out there. We need to consult with that because that's the only baseline benchmark we have. So I'm sort of putting these North American codes there because I do have information on that. And you can use very smart large language models to get at that. I do want to sort of tell you that all of the information in GIS, this is more for my class, is connected with the tabular information. We've all seen tables in the class, and I'm going to be using those tables in order to link the assets to specific things. And you can see that each of these will be connected with the address and the emission, the means, and everything. The whole, I have like more than 60 variables there, associated with each of the assets. That would give me information more than the emission. I could have the number of employees, square footage of the asset. All of the information is stored in this kind of a GIS. So my class should appreciate that this is very important because it's all connected with tables. I did also want to talk about something else from the point of view of my class and for the general audience. These kinds of maps come at multiple spatial resolutions. You've seen zip code map, you can see county map, state map, congressional district, which is very important for Robert. And I added that just for you, Robert. So here is a congressional map, and I don't want to make any comments on the colors at this map because this is like such a disappointing performance for 2024. And the last map is the county map. So you can see I can color these counties on many census attributes, and it would be so very useful to sort of have this at our fingertips because so much information is available and we can draw insights using the data that's readily available. So then comes a question, what are we doing with remote sensing? There are many sensors that are available. And for most of the work, we use free sensors, right? Meaning the data is available free to us. So people have heard Landsat, which is the 30-meter resolution, and it's been flying around from the 1970s. We have a whole time series of data to look at deforestation and assessing what's happening in Amazon. You could look at the new European satellites, which began in the mid 2005 or 2006, which is the Sentinel. And Europe is now very proud of its satellite, and they're doing a lot to promote all their data products. And there's a lot of science in each of these satellites. And MODIS is the other satellite, which is a coarser resolution, 1 kilometer resolution. So you may ask me, why am I showing this? All of the data that we use today on a global scale comes from this. Why is it going to help me in financial sustainability and regulation? These satellites update themselves weekly, 16 days. They could even be done daily if you had the money. But we can get such dynamic flow of information, and such mapping and looking at satellites became important when we had COVID, and we saw that all the transportation emissions falling down, and you could see the Taj Mahal standing in Delhi, and they showed clear pictures of what it looks like when the emissions come down. And all of this is dynamic. So you can capture it every week and keep updating. And we don't have that kind of data. Companies don't have this kind of data because they only are going to do their paperwork once a year. And they have to report every quarter. They don't change it. They report for that particular year. Why is it? It's not the fault of the company that they're not reporting. Even a company like Amazon, I mean, it requires a lot of, money and a lot of people to put this together, the report together. So they don't want to do it. So these kinds of satellites offer you a first-hand look at emission if you were to do it correctly. And there's a lot of science involved in it. And we in the Department of Earth and Environment, we have a whole remote sensing set of scientists who do nothing but this. So there's the science of remote sensing. I'm not going to talk about the science of remote sensing. I'm talking about the products coming out of remote sensing. And the book, of course, has a chapter that talks about the science of remote sensing. So I want to tell you that we could do carbon accounting, which is deforestation using satellite. We could do land use monitoring, which is changing landscape. Like in Indonesia, all the peatlands are gone. They've planted it all with palm oil, and that is of concern. And we looked at it as part of one of our IMAP projects, and Mira was involved in it. The next thing is climate risk and resilience, which is the valuation of assets, especially real estate. If you look at it, you have to look at what is the sea level rise, what's the flood, what's the risk. Every potential risk has to be calculated. And I have a very interesting example of solar panels in Texas, because two students in my class are from Texas, and they wanted to look at something which is renewable energy. So if you look at solar panels too, you need to look at threat. You would say, what is a threat in Texas, right? Hailstones is one of the biggest threats that impacts the panels. And so I want to bring your attention to that project. How do you do CapEx and OpEx on that risk? Um, Looking further, so here is a picture that you would see over and over again. So this is basically the science of remote sensing. I'm showing you like a shorthand version of it, where I have the wavelengths, the visible, near infrared, mid infrared, and I'm showing three different, land cover types: vegetation, soil, and water. Each one of these has a different signature on those wavelengths, and that is the science of remote sensing. How do you identify vegetation? How do you identify dying vegetation? How do you identify water? And how do you identify soil and all its, perturbations happening because of climate change? So there is a whole lot of papers, there's a whole lot of science. All of this has to be used by the sustainable finance community in order to, get the data right and get the valuation right. What is there and what's disappearing? So I want to sort of show you. I mentioned multiple times that there are many different types of satellites. So I'm showing you the Sentinel. I'm showing you the different sets of Landsat as well as MODIS. All of these have different wavelengths, and I have the wavelengths on column one. So I have to match what exactly is green vegetation, what's going to be water, what's going to be ice. And I have to apply the right metrics in order to do the mapping using remote sensing satellite data. In the old days, if I were to look at change, I distinctly remember working with people in my department. I could only do 2 years, the start year, the end year of deforestation. Now we have everything on the cloud. There is a Google Earth engine where all the heavy computation is performed by the Earth engine. And we can pretty much run it sitting on our desk, and it stores and processes the data and stores and provides you the data products. So this has become so important. It grows day by day. And Google Earth Engine has also made it more democratic in the sense that everybody in any part of the world can sign in and get in. Previously, half the world couldn't use any of these images. The US changed its policy and made much of the information of Landsat free, and so does Europe. All of this is available in terms of free processing and storage on Google Earth Engine. So we use a lot of Google Earth Engine for multiple products because we just can't handle the volume of data. It's too much. So coming back, I end up with that. And you can ask me questions later. So I wanted to give you some examples of some of the things that I'm working on, which come close enough and I'm showing you, because you can download these images free from either the NASA website or from, European website. And this is about showing different things. So this shows an open pit mine in Indonesia. I'm interested in mining, especially given the fact that we are all going to be looking at rare earths, minerals, and the supply chains and all the problems that it's going to cause. And more importantly, from the point of view of ESG, it's also about children who are employed in these mines, especially in a country like the Congo. So we can also look at Venice, which has been overstudied because of all the canals and all the things happening in terms of flooding, and it's like every year is a new kind of a threat to the city of Venice. So now I want to talk about what does it all add up to in terms of our work here. So I'm going to show you a case study. So the case study that I'm showing you is an example of solar panels in Texas. And I am going to use this example again, but it kind of gives you the lay of the land, and it shows you that for that particular kind of an asset, I first need to geolocate the address as well as the latitude and longitude. I need to know the coordinates to put on the map. And then I have to take a footprint map. I have to digitize the footprint of that asset because I have to attribute emissions to that asset, right? And then I would be able to get the satellite data, and I'm going to be using private and public satellites. And I can also use ground sensor networks that NASA and the world has. And I can also use drone imagery to evaluate satellites. But basically, in the middle, I'm showing the data harmonization. All of this has to be layered one on top of the other, and you need to draw intelligence. And here is where modeling comes in. You need to know what's the science and how you're going to, are you really thinking about soils here? What exactly is the aspect of things of soil that you want to consider or rainfall? You could include population, anything that you have by way of data sets and data layers, if it is pertinent to the problem. And more recently, we've started adding and doing things with deep learning AI, which is convolution neural networks that are much faster to run. And these are like models that are almost parallel to LLMs. They came about a little earlier, all to do with image processing. And so there's a lot of interest in these kinds of methods to classify. So here is a map that I want to show you in Europe, in Austria. In a particular town of Amsterdam, which is given the emission map for the city. You can see that the red spot are the high spots of emission. These are places of manufacturing, or perhaps have something that makes them sort of give more emission. But this is a calculation based on building to building. Knowing the properties of the building, knowing the square footage of the building, knowing the utility of the building, you calculate what exactly is the town level emission. This is a requirement of the European regulation at this point. Every town in Europe, in the EU, has to have a plan where they're telling you what's going to happen for the year 2030, all the way up to 2050. Then they have to bring everything to net zero emission. So I forgot to mention, emissions, and I have a slide on that. But anyway, we have to all the regulations about these greenhouse gas emissions that I'm showing you. So there's a lot of information available that one can calculate. So this is a more regional level analysis. This is a paper that we wrote a few years ago, and it looks at deforestation in Indonesia. And you can see the green in the first map has completely disappeared in the next map. Why is that? Because they've cut down all the trees. They have either put in coal mines, or they put in palm oil. They've done something else with the trees. So the forest, which is the tropical rainforest, has disappeared. And so this has consequences for biodiversity. So in this paper, we talk about biodiversity, and we've done what's called structural modeling of the forest, looking at what's the core of the forest, what's the corridors, and where do animals live, what species lives where. Because remember, some species are iconic endangered species. They carry a more higher monetary value. A crow may not have the same value. A pigeon may have a value zero in terms of ecosystems. Robot snakes may not have much value. It's only of value to Robert. So Robert Kaufman, who's sitting here, loves snakes and lizards. So that has no value in most cases, unless they are endangered. So we've done all these calculations, and this is an important piece of work that we did with the GDP and Kevin Gallagher's group at the Global Development Policy Center. What Kevin's group, in a series of 6 papers, we showed was that most of the investments from Bank of China and a couple of other banks, from China, which were investing in coal, caused a lot of damage to these forests and biodiversity. So once all the experts began to warn, China took an official policy, I think in 2021, saying that they will no longer, as part of the Bank of China, will not invest in coal anymore. Especially in these countries, developing nations across the globe, they would rather go for renewables like hydroelectricity or solar. So that's a big change, which was attributable to the GDP Center here in Boston, ABU. So I also want to show you other things that you can do in terms of, GIS. But basically now I want to move into more the regulatory framework. If you have to look at what exactly are the regulations, yeah. When we look at the regulations and frameworks, we can see that greenhouse gas reporting is number one. So the US SEC under Gary Gensler had climate disclosures. He first issued a statement, several people responded, some companies did not like it. And in the end, with the Trump administration coming in, the whole thing disappeared. So no company in the US, as far as I know, needs to report on climate, any sort of regulation piece, because that's the first thing they pulled out. But companies still need to keep doing that, because in Europe, especially if you're doing trade with Europe, starting in another year, you have to report in Europe what exactly is your emission before you do the trade. And Canada has climate policies in place. Even a country like Switzerland has climate policy in place. China has some, not very sure, but we can talk about it. Australia and other countries do have something. And we want to talk about the European Union CSRD, which is the Sustainability Regulation Framework, and SFDR, and I'll explain both. And there is a more general framework, which is for nature finance, which is called TNFD, which is the Task Force on Nature Related Financial Disclosure. This is measuring the impact of every type of investment that you make and what is it going to impact in terms of biodiversity, including endangered species or water or forest. All this requires a lot of accounting because you have to be exactly right. Previously, people could get away saying, oh, we don't know, we have not collecting the data. So for smaller firms, it's very difficult to collect this data. For larger firms, they're not used to it yet. But in Europe right now, you got to do this. And European regulations also ask for third-party verification. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like. And then many of the countries have made net zero commitments. And this is part of all of the central banks in the world got together and also have a banking alliance, which is called net zero. And I think this was part of one of the IMAP 2 years ago. Somebody talked about it. And then, of course, there are many data gaps and challenges. We are constantly trying to improve data and information and accounting. How do we account exactly? And how do we, at all costs, avoid greenwashing? So you can't, if you're doing carbon credits, you can't sell the same piece of forest to Delta Airlines and Apple. That has happened before. So now everything has to be correctly verified and it has to be on the verifiable blockchain. So here are the four different types of scopes that the European regulations ask you to ask companies and countries and banks to report on. Direct greenhouse gas emissions coming from the asset or all of the company's, assets. And this is associated with the combustion of fossil fuels. So if they are using solar panels or hydroelectricity, this is a pretty good situation of scope one because their emissions are going to be low. Scope two is the indirect emission, which again is the purchase of electricity. So you may think you're doing good, but the people that you're buying, the electric company that you're buying it from, may not be using renewables. So this has become very important. And then scope three is the supply chains. This is a very difficult, one to treat or to handle because nobody knows if it's a company like Apple, it's a supplier, sub-supplier, sub-supplier. There are about 60 different nodes of that supply chain. Apple has no idea. Tim Cook will have no idea what the lowest, supplier is. Remember, they got into trouble with China because they were employing the Uyghur, slaves. So right now we know that for many of the iPhones that we hold in our hands, the minerals are all extracted by children in the Congo. So we are actually not helping at all. But we need to do this accounting in order for this to be correct. So why do I care about this? I care about it because there's so many laws that the EU has put in, including this one called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that even the US companies have to answer in the next year or so. Why? Because if you trade with Europe, you have to account for your carbon that's entering and leaving. So European companies complain saying that they have to go with all these regulations, whereas a country like China could come in with no regulation. So they try to make it a level playing field by saying everybody has to account for carbon if you want to trade in Europe. So you may ask me, why do I need to trade with the European Union? It's the second largest bloc in terms of, trading partners that the US has. So I just wanted to give you, these are all the letters in blue are all the ones that are coming forth from Europe at this point. And so you may ask me, why am I so focused on Europe? I'm sorry to say all the regulations in the US have disappeared. So I'm focusing on Europe, hoping that they would teach us something. So the Europe has assured, because of the SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, every financial institution, a bank, an asset manager in Europe has to sort of integrate what are called, what is called the European Green Deal. And they have to report on what is called the principal adverse impacts. These principal adverse impacts, many of them are spatial or geospatial. You need a GIS, you need a satellite in order to account for that particular impact. So you can see the first one is the carbon footprint that they are asking. The second one is the greenhouse gas intensity of all the investee companies of a bank. The fossil fuel exposure, anywhere and anywhere have they used fossil fuel, including people who commute back and forth. And there is also the biodiversity impact that most companies don't know about, and water and waste discharge, which has become a huge issue for data centers. Recently, we were involved in talks of the green data centers because there's so much water used in any data center. So you can imagine all the accounting that has to happen. On the other side is the social and governance. Can anybody tell me what the first icon is? I couldn't find a good icon for this, so I just showed that. The first one, which has got the dollar sign.
The gender pay gap.
It's the gender pay gap. Very good. Gender pay gap is the number one thing that Europe sort of, insists that people pay attention to. The second one is human rights, and they also look at guns. So I don't want to get into this debate, but you know what I'm saying. Guns sort of, leak by. But anyway, those are the things under social and governance. So what happens if I'm a company? I don't want to report on any of this in Europe. What happens to me? What do you think? What's the common sense logic tip? What does it tell you? They are going to put a big penalty on you, huge penalty if you don't pay up, if you don't sort of account. If you didn't know, you could perhaps say not applicable. I've seen some companies say not applicable. Not everybody is reporting, especially for things which are so hard. Gender pay gap is a very hard one to explain. So far, we only have numbers at the level of the, of the maybe the C-suite, the CEO or the CFO and so on. We don't know in Google, for example, or even Amazon, what's the lowest level of gender pay gap that we can examine. The workers who are bringing in your parcels. Is there a pay gap there? Hard to know. So you have to use glass doors, and that's one of the research initiatives that Susan in IMAP, supported. Using glass doors, you can get proxy information on gender pay gap. So I wanted to illustrate an example using this European framework, which is so hard. So they're asking you what exactly the bank, anybody has to say, what exactly is your holding? And here is how a steel company is reporting. What is my objective in order to get some kind of financial, instrument put in place? I need to talk about my data versus what does the sector report on that particular emission. Then I need to talk about what is my target score? What do I hope to achieve by the year 2030? And am I doing okay compared with the best of the cohort of the group of companies that are making steel? By the way, I don't know any steel company that's so green. The one that probably comes closest to is the Cleveland Cliff, which is in the US. And then you need to calculate what is called a weighted score. And then you need to calculate the emissions. And then, you can apply for a particular green bond treatment and sort of say what are all the things that you satisfy. So we worked out this example and we can come up with all kinds of things of the steel manufacturer. In the end, this particular steel company doesn't sort of, it's medium high climate emission score. So it's not all that great, but related to green infrastructure, it can receive favorable treatment in Europe based on this. So you may say all of this seems kind of, numbers hastily thrown together. Most companies don't have these numbers. They are going with a third party sort of number system in order to get some semblance of intelligence on these numbers. So we can only hope such accounting will improve in the future years. Right now, some of these numbers are questionable. So I wanted to give you an example of how difficult it is to do this because not everybody is open. How do I know the best steel company? Everybody can claim to be a best steel company, that it's green steel. So if you attach the word green to anything, it's very good. So I should say it's green BU2 at this point. So the next thing I wanted to sort of mention is the work that we did in our chapter, which is looking at the blockchain rendition of climate finance. So you estimate, you sort of, borrow something from a farmer who's growing olives or apples. And we've done this in one of the projects with one of the guys I interviewed, Nick Zanderfeld, that I showed you before. He has a company which gives you what is called fungible tokens, but it gives you what is called NF trees. So it gives you credit in the form of a tree. So these tree tokens are given to the farmer, and the farmer has to monitor the growth of the trees or the forest in his yard. And all of this is now being watched by a drone or a satellite. So you see many of these farms, especially in parts of Spain, the olive trees have been infested with infection and disease and so on. So that'll bring down your carbon, right? The tree at the beginning will not be able to sequester so much carbon. Everything has to be calculated. What type of tree, what's the maturity, what type of carbon is it sequenced above ground and below ground. So if you take all these calculations, everything has to be put on that blockchain. And somebody who's buying this credit will be able to see all this and you would be able to pay, in terms of money. And so the farmer gets a credit. So a lot of farmers in Africa, even for simple things they own, like a plot of land, a plot of grass, are now buying these kinds of tree tokens. And they are able to trade with partners as big as Amazon or Delta. Big companies in Europe have to buy carbon offsets and do this kind of a scheme in order to make themselves legally responsible. So there's a lot that goes on in this space. Today the price of carbon that I checked in the European market is 82 euros. Ask me what's the price in the US. It's a big fat zero. No price. State of California, there's a price. What is it? Take a wild guess. Would it be $100? $60? It sort of varies. It could be anywhere between $50 to $69, depending on what is the official rate that the state is advocating. So all of these are websites that give you all this. And in Europe now, they're encouraging people to trade in the carbon markets. So you've heard about grain markets. You've heard about, other types of markets. Now you can trade in carbon. Now, I don't know how many of you are science fiction fans. There was a very famous book written by Gene Stanley Robinson, The Ministry of Truth. If you haven't read it, you should read it because the whole book is about climate change and the disasters. And he's the first person who mentions these carbon tokens and how they would work. And it is really a phenomenal book because it opens your eyes to what's about to happen. So we use a lot of that kind of book knowledge also. So here is another one, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive from Europe. I am telling you that there's a lot of opportunities for us to work here through IMAP and through other places because so many regulations in Europe. It's like a world of regulations. So this one calls for chronic versus acute hazards. Look at the type of hazards that they have. All of this is NOAA data or climate data, weather underground, or things that we already know in terms of GIS and satellites. They're looking at changing temperatures. They're looking at heat stress, temperature variability, permafrost thaw. All of these things are considered, chronic, which means they are forever present. Acute ones are like the wildfires of California. So you can see that the European Central Bank wants to manage climate related risk. It wants to support the green transition, and it also wants to provide transparency and reducing the environmental impact. Everything it wants is quantitative numbers. It no longer believes high, medium, low risk. It wants numbers. Who's going to be impacted, what sector of industry, all of that has to be accounted for in terms of CSRD. And I just wanted to, oops. Oh, I wanted to show you this one slide, which we attempted to do. This is for my two students from Texas. I'm paying you a lot of credit for this because we talked about it in class. So there's a lot of solar panels. I don't know how many of you know, Texas has pretty much become the capital of solar energy in the United States. They have a huge amount of investment and they were very smart with Biden. They got a lot of money under the Inflation Reduction Act. And a lot of it was public-private partnership, meaning a lot of venture capital companies got in, like the likes of Apollo got in to invest in these farms. And of course, they want to know what exactly is their risk. Not that they have to report, but it's part of their calculation. CapEx and OpEx, operational risk and capital risk. So if you look at a risk like hailstorm, you need to have a lot of math behind it in terms of understanding what's the probability distribution of the different types of hailstones. What's the size? What do I need to do for that particular panel? How do I make it, fold up when there's a hailstorm? It is crazy. How many days will I be shut down? Was the question I was asked. It's hard to predict all these things, but based on the past, they want to know. But then you have to tell them past no longer predicts the future, right? You have to take it as it comes and leave a certain amount of money. So we did a lot of this kind of mapping, trying to find out which of the locations would be more risk averse compared with the other. And they obviously are spending a lot of money, millions of dollars on, investing in this farm, solar farm. So the last thing that I wanted to touch upon is, and I will go into details if you want, are the different financial instruments. And this is again important for accounting because you do different types of accounting for different instruments. The first one is debt for nature swaps. A country which has got high debts. This is something that China has, done to all the countries that it trades with, especially Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So in terms of debt, I mean, the country gives away the forest or gives away something by way of getting debt relief, right? So this is something that has happened in the past 10 years or so. There's also payment for ecosystem services. And if you have any questions, ask Meera. She's sitting here. She is like working with me on Belize, looking at payments for mangrove trees. How do you plant mangrove? How do you get a payment? It takes, I had no idea. It takes 4 long years for the mangrove even to pop up if it survives. It is a long time for the mangroves to grow back, and it's so easy to cut them. So China is dredging all over Belize. So that's the sad part of the opposite side of the story. Then there's environmental taxes and charges that one can levy upon. So anytime you have a project like with the World Bank or even looking at DRC, you need to look at the environmental laws that are in place, at least on paper. None of these countries really implement, but they have laws in place. So one needs to pay attention to that. Then there is the green bonds that we are very familiar with, green loans, blue bonds, blue loans, and microcredits. The blue bonds are very popular in terms of ocean credits. So you can have coral reefs and you can say, that's an investment. Give us, we are issuing blue bonds. So pension funds in Europe are buying into that kind of schemes of blue bonds and green bonds elsewhere in the world. Some of them, pension funds, this is especially from Japan, are investing in Southeast Asia to women and children, education, and things like that. At some point, we may need these kinds of loans in the US if the Department of Education is dissolved. So these kinds of microcredits are available in Southeast Asia. A lot of money goes into microcredits. And the most famous person was the Nobel laureate who got for microcredits, Mohammed Yunus. He got for the microcredit idea of issuing loans for women who could never find loans otherwise. And then the fifth one is the biodiversity offsets. You pay money to a country to have a biodiversity offset, and it has to sort of, be very strict. And somebody is investing, like the World Bank or a Nordic bank is investing. Then there is public-private partnership, which is, like the one I mentioned in Texas under the Inflation Reduction Act, when VC companies went in and bought solar farms in Texas. So that's another vehicle of investment. So this gives you an idea that you can bridge the gap between regulation and the so-called fintech instruments. These are all the things that are available. And many of these now are all on your a fintech app phone, even, all these are apps. You can watch everything. And so Massachusetts, there's something called the Mass Challenge, which is in the Seaport District, where all small businesses come together. And a lot of ideas over 2 years ago was about fintech. Everybody had a fintech solution for banking, for taking care of senior citizens, for investing elsewhere, and so on. I think now the noise would have died down. Now it's all AI. So, what do you do for these things? You need to know frameworks or guidelines. You need to have what are the data variables that you're going to account for? What are the metrics? These are called KPIs, key performance indicators. What are the metrics that you're going to follow in order to measure success or failures? What is the instrument that you're going to use and how do you report on it? Yeah. Because somebody is investing in you, you have to report every 6 months or every month that that you have to do as part of the contract. So, in terms of conclusion, and I hope you have a lot of questions. Um, in conclusion, we say we are at a very defining point in terms of how technology, finance, and sustainability is coming together. The fusion of this geospatial intelligence that I gave you, because everything is located on the earth. It is not located on Facebook. Everything has a physical location on the earth, which means, you can use satellites and GIS sort of technologies. You can also use AI and fintech to address some of these sustainability problems. And the challenge is, how do you sort of get the right data and the right metrics in order to report and you don't greenwash? because greenwashing has been the bane to our existence in terms of sustainability reporting. And how do we convince people that we can do this right? And the call to action is all financial institutions, including the Central Bank of Europe, has to adopt these kinds of data-driven sustainability measures. And the other thing which is of concern now is AI and the ethics of using AI. The ethical dimension is something that everybody is talking about. And that's still a big question mark. What exactly is AI? How is it going to help us? What kind of private information is it harvesting from us as we sort of go through using AI? Right now, it's running on Reddit and Facebook and X. But if you were to really train it, it needs more data. And that's your and my private data. So that's one thing. And obviously, fintech leaders must always think about these planetary boundaries because we've already crossed six of them, three more to go. And one is almost close enough. And, it's not just for us, it's also for future generations of the planet and to maintain the Earth's stability and resilience. We need to do this. And we've done everything. I've done everything I can for the last 20 years. The only thing that talks is money. And that's how I got into finance because there's no other way to help anybody other than you say that there's investment coming your way. So we had to learn everything from scratch. And this was during the time of COVID. And I had funding from IMAP, of course. We did a project for IMAP for looking at palm trees and palm cultivation. Global Development Policy Center gave me money. BU Ignition Grant gave me money to start a company. And my PIs on the NSF projects are two professors from biology, Les Kaufman and Ethan Dial. I have two NSF projects and proposals with them. We also did a project for the Department of Interior and Offshore Wind, and that is a report that will be released. And my students, Meera is here, rest of them are missing. And then there's three other people who joined and gave a lot from Floodlight, which is the company that I'm affiliated. So I'm going to stop there and take your questions. I also wanted to announce this is the textbook that's available in Springer. It's available free for all the BU library card holders. You can, download one chapter at a time, and they're charging $40 for download for one chapter. So, and then I also gave you the Amazon code. And then this is
Tell me, what is so if you have a traditional power plant, it's gonna go down, there's scheduled maintenance, there's breakdowns. How does that compare to like hail risk for, solar panels, which don't have these kind of planned mechanical difficulties?
so the regular things in terms of, power plant going down is accounted by the company by some other way. The hailstorm one is a specific request from the European Central Bank and the EU CSRD to give the right reporting of what is the risk of climate risk. So it's like a whole new account.
But is it comparable size, or is it like one much bigger than the other, the risk to?
Some of the hailstorms are pretty bad, right? Wildfires in California, we know has impacted real estate probably in billions, right? The insurance company has already paid out, but it's going to be a long time before we know what the true cost is. But if the same wildfire impacted vineyards in California, we immediately know the price. So, it's like if a company or if some particular sector of a industry is impacted, it's easier to know because we have previous figures that we can compare with. But people and real estate property is a little more tricky. Hey, Walker.
So you talked about a lot with the EU focusing on regulation and that motivating companies to actually work towards doing something green. But how do we in the US, because regulation is going away, have you found any way that motivates them towards actually investing in green technology and holding themselves accountable?
That's going on side by side. That's a good question. State of California is a country to itself. It has all rules and laws, everything in place. And I have a slide showing the specific things that they have come up with in terms of rules. And Massachusetts has a climate plan. Many of the states have a climate plan, and many cities whose mayors are all Democratic have signed a pledge. And that's part of the BU initiative on cities that was first done, by Bloomberg. So 300 cities in the US have joined forces to account for their climate footprint. So cities and some states have done it, but it is not the federal sort of a mandate that you have to report on 10K, the forms that a company files. That's not happening. States are free to do what they want.
Uh,
Texas in particular won't report. He's from Texas, by the way.
Sort of along that lines, like how differently are we seeing the companies act? Because I'm assuming we're focusing on large companies and the fact that they are like global and interconnected. So they basically have to conform to the EU regulations anyway.
Exactly.
So are they in any meaningful way able to act differently in the US, even though we have less regulation?
So the one thing that's very interesting, and Robert can comment on it. So this is economics, Robert. So I talk to Robert all the time. He's like my constant, friend to bounce off ideas. So what is happening is it's no longer this thing of social currency. It's economic viability and economic losses that companies face if they don't report. If they report it on the 10K, there's some protection against lawsuits. So pharmaceutical companies, many of them are located on the East Coast, New Jersey, New York, and all of them had floods and things where, or Puerto Rico is another place where many pharmaceutical factories are located. And they do have to report everything because otherwise they're liable to lawsuits. So companies, because of their economic, losses and gains, they will report because that gives them some protection. So it is all left up to them. If you think it doesn't matter, you won't. But large companies like Amazon or Merck or Pfizer will report. And many of them are international in footprint, so they have to.
I have a question.
Viva.
Or if you can.
Yes.
me,
No,
please.
no, you have a soft voice.
So, I'm pretty loud anyway. So, it's a great presentation. Thank you so much. And, I am so lucky to be here because, and now I am kind of understanding more about like what is there on the physical world, what we are measuring, what type of data available out there. I mean, I was expecting and imagining this would be that, I mean, the amount of data you have is amazing. But I'm kind of in my mind trying to put economics with this data, and you have already doing so. But in that transition, I mean, we talked about accounting, the importance of accounting. So accounting physical units versus accounting money is a bit different, right? So we are just in the transition. So we do some part of it, and the valuation is going to be important here, and accounting in business is going to be important over here. So in these physical data sets, the satellites, and you are basically having layers of data. Uh, are there any way, or are there any platforms that we start to add socioeconomic data in a more micro granular scale to these data sets that you have, or it's not done yet? So I seen population, but for example, value added of a region from an economic output is going to be very valuable in terms of converting overall general aggregate, kind of dollar value of a foregone ecosystem services. So therefore, in that regard, where we are at in terms of accounting, but accounting exactly what? Are we completing the physical, accounting of physical changes? And what are the socioeconomic drivers or the data that we are appending to the existing data sets that you have been having? Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't show you all the examples, obviously. There are some where we get down to the level of the socioeconomic data. So I did a project with, for looking at a skin cancer company, as skin cancer is increasing across the US because of climate change. And the other factor is a lot of senior citizens, including your grandmas and grandpas, are not going to Florida. They prefer to live in New York or in Boston. And there's more UV here, or even in Illinois. So skin cancer companies have become, that's become a business, the clinics and the doctors and the setup for treatment. So they were asking me to do it at the level of a zip code, looking at the socioeconomic data, block level data of who lives where, what ethnicity, what background, what race. Obviously, a certain types of skin cancer affects one race more dominantly than the other. So there is data available socioeconomic wise, but it depends what country. The US has all the data available, down to the level of, you said your sister was working, down to the micro, level, but other countries like China, I won't have anything available. Census I'll have to buy even, right? Europe is also very hard to get, tricky to get data. India, census is available for sale. You need to know somebody to buy this data. So a lot of countries, it's next to impossible to find data. But in the US, so far, the data is available, at the level that you would want, or you can buy it from somebody
Okay, thank
because
you.
they have estimated it at that level.
Okay.